This is our first real painting for this course. I did mention that I work towards building up on the knowledge you gain step by step and then increase it in the following class. In this way we go back to our palettes and use them in a way that you may find surprising. The messy palette is the winner here because that is the easy method of mixing the greys. This is not the most bright and cheerful painting you may ever do, but in its subtlety you will learn a lot. Briefly, I will talk about composition and size relationships when we analyse our photo references. But then we will have some fun with bush backgrounds and foregrounds. Perfection is not the name of the game here. Messy is good. Welcome again tonight. We'll get started. Tonight is all about backgrounds on the trees. Well, at least the first half of the night is. And in particular grey. How do we make grey? What is, do we use a tube colour? Do we mix it? How does all of that work? Well, from my point of view, greys are definitely much better if you make them, because then you get some variation that you wouldn't get if you just used a straight tube colour of any kind. And the other thing about this is where my palette comes into its own, and it's one of the reasons I don't actually clean, because I'm just going to do a couple little examples of what's on my palette without doing anything else except mixing it up. And so that's this one, and I've got a little bit of a black grey there. This one here that looks really strange is a yellowish grey. This one down the bottom here is one that we're definitely going to be using tonight as a greenish grey. And on the other side, just because, look at that, it's more of a bluish grey. So without even having to try, I've already made 4 different greys. And from there on I can tweak them as I want to. So if I decided that that's too black grey, all I need to do is, and I want it to be a bit more of a violet grey for instance, I can just put a little bit of pink into it. I'm not going to do anything else now for a minute, and just there you go, you've got a violet and pinkish grey. If I wanted it to be more darker, more of a violet grey, I've just literally put a little bit of blue into it as well. If I needed that to be still more blue, I have ended up with, it's still very violet, but it's still, so it's more of a blue violet grey. And that's what I do with all of my colours, and especially when I'm working with background colours, the greens are in particular the ones that can be changed up very quickly. And I don't really need to wash my brush out in between, because funnily enough we're talking greys. Okay, so if I wanted it to be, that's quite a green already. So if I needed that to be, and I've got all sorts of colours happening here. Did you see how that some pink was coming into that? And now I've ended up with some, again, quite a dark black grey. But if I needed that to be a darker green, I can either put a bit of just plain green into it, or I can actually mix a bit of blue and yellow into it to make these. So I love playing with greys.
even there. And again, we've got the darker grey happening there. Green-grey, I should say. So that's how I work with my palette. If I was mixing one right from the word go, two of my favourite colours, and I'll just move that down. Two of my favourite colours to mix a grey or a black, if you make it thick enough. Ultramarine blue, and either burnt sienna or burnt umber. I'll just use burnt sienna to start with, and already I have a mid-grey. Very similar to what happened up here. And if I wanted it to be more bluish, I add a bit of blue. If I want it to be more warmer and make it more of almost a brownish grey, I can put a little bit more of that colour in.
Which colour is that?
This one's burnt sienna.
Burnt sienna.
Burnt sienna. Burnt umber would do a similar thing, make it a little bit darker. If I needed it to be a very dark greyish colour, you make the paint stronger. So instead of just working from my liquidy colour that I've mixed up,
What blue's that?
this one's ultramarine,
Right.
and it's great for this. And I'm just going to add a little bit of brown, dark brown, whatever colour that may be, and we end up with something that's even darker still. So again, that can be. The fun part comes when you actually don't mix them too much. So if I put blue over here and a little bit of that there, and rather than have them all mixed into one thing, I will just pick up both, and there should be some variation when I work it through. Probably haven't got quite enough blue in there. So that's much nicer. I'll just turn that the other way. That's much nicer as a grey than if I was to try and use a tube colour. Tube colours will work, but all of these are variations of grey. And that's why I use my palette, and that's why I don't clean it. As far as I'm concerned, that they make the best greys just by using a palette. Okay, so, and I can still alter some of that, add extra colours into it and make it a little bit different again. So we're working tonight on background greens. Most of these backgrounds tend to be quite grey, greyish green. Two reasons, because that's what our Australian bush is like anyway, because you don't get too many bright colours in the Australian bush. It's always dryish. Well, we're not talking rainforest here, okay? Australian bush with gum trees and all that sort of stuff, which of course is what this is. It has a greenish look, but they're usually quite greyish at the same time. And the other thing is, we don't want it to compete with what we are actually doing as a focal point. So this is the painting. That's more or less what we're doing tonight. Okay, so what you can see there is, for starters, a variation in, even though that's fairly close, there is variation in where I've placed the trees. So always look at your reference, look at what's going to happen with it, make it better. I'm sorry, but these photos are just photos. I don't take photos with an eye for composition, yes, but I'm very much a point and shoot person. And so I look for something that's interesting, I take a photo or several, and then I work out, once I get home, which ones do I actually want to paint. So that's where this comes in. And so then we get into these, also the darker colours there as well. So we'll talk about that one a bit later on when we get to the trees. This is the sort of painting where you do the background before you do the main focal point. So the fun part will be painting around this stuff. So we do need some drawing here tonight. So we haven't done that before, at least very little bit. But we do need to draw where our trees are going, at least in a main sort of way. Make that one a bit bigger than what it is in the photo that you see. And the reason is we want it to really stand out. We want to make this be a picture, a painting, not just a replica of the photo. So we use our artistic license to change things up where we need to. And the other thing I might tell you is I rarely ever have straight trees. What I try to avoid always is just doing a tree like this and then have a couple out that way. Okay, so we want something a little bit more interesting. So always think about how that works. There is a tree that's backward, this one's actually in front, but I sort of like the idea of having it back behind, again because I want this tree, which I find the nicest out of that little grouping, to be the one I want to focus on. And I kind of like also the way it's angled away. Didn't do it quite as much in this one. It's actually quite straight. I'm going to change that up again tonight. Because I may do the same, use the same reference, but it's rare that I end up with the same painting. Similar, yep, but not necessarily the same. That one can go back behind, I think, and see what the go is with that. Okay, something like that. The other thing you might notice as I'm sketching is that I, again, don't use curves. It's not going to be a tree that does this. I'm not going to have my branches do this way. That's not how I sketch. Funnily enough, branches that are curved, and I'm going to say it would look like we see them in the out there. They don't read as well as using angles. So when you are sketching up, try and use angles, especially at the intersections where possible, and that way you get it's a more dynamic sort of look. And this one here I'm going to have coming up from the base here a bit more. So remember what I said about the half and half and half rule? The branches are about half of what the trunk is. The next set of branches are about half of what that one is, and so on. And that way you get something that actually looks like it belongs. You don't end up with this way thick one up the top here. You've got to be able to support your branches with your trees and tree trunks and your other branches. Okay, we have a basic horizon there, so I'm just going to have that somewhere here. Don't need too much there. And the only other thing I want to do is leave some of those lights. To do that, again, you can give yourself a suggestion of where there might be that lighter section, but I don't go too much into any detail in that background section. Most of it's going to happen with your brushes anyway. And again, I'm not doing any specific detail on the foreground either. So basically that's my complete sketch. Next thing, now we're working with smaller areas because we're going to actually paint around these trees. And so I'm only going to use a smaller brush. That one might be still okay. Slightly bigger, it's a size 10, that's a size 8. And so 8 is just about my favourite brush ever, that as far as size goes. So I'm going to make sure that my greens are the sort of greens that I want. And what I'm looking for is, at the moment, a mid-green. And if I need it to be a little bit brighter, I have my bright green that I can then add a little bit of colour without it being overpowering. If I want a dark green, is my other one dark enough? Not quite. I need it to be a bit stronger than that. So I'm actually going to mix up, sorry I should do that this way. So I've actually just put in some blue and I'm going to come back in with my sap green, and because that gives me a nice blue grey there. If it's not grey enough, a little bit of burnt sienna will make that darker. And so what I've ended up with here is a lovely blue, grey, green. I know that it doesn't quite look as dark as green as you might think, but we're talking a darker colour. We don't want this to be too light, but on this other one we can go a little bit yeah, I mean, that's, so long as it's a little bit greyish, I think it'll be fine. That's just a little bit, just a hint of grey into the sap green there. And I just clean up my palette this way, so it's about the cleanest it ever is as well after I've been playing with greys. So that's that. Okay, so I'm just going to do this one layer. I think I'll even do the foliage on the, yeah, I'm just going to do some of this now. The other colour I often put into greens is actually a little bit of burnt sienna in particular, but now I have to get in between here, so just using the tip of my brush. You might also notice that I'm not being too straight along here. Again, I like the idea of having it a little bit of a broken edge. And I'm going to, yeah.
Colouring moving solid or
No. No, actually, can you see how there's little bits of light in through there? Partially because, especially towards the top, it gets feathery where the foliage actually starts being very sparse. I probably will fill in some more of this because I was also just about to put in some blue, some of the dark green, and so some of those bits of light will end up being taken and again here where the ground meets the other ground, I'm again not trying to make it look too straight. I do like things where you're using, and this the roughness of the paper to give it that look of using the roughness of the paper to give me a broken line like that, see? Coming in, smaller brush to use, and still thinking foliage has got lights and darks. It's not just all one colour. And in fact, I think we're probably losing a bit of it over here already. The other thing is, if you don't end up with as much of the darks as you would like, it is okay to come back in later on and still do a little bit of that. While I'm still working here, I'm going to put in a little bit of burnt sienna. Because if you think about it, foliage in the bush or whatever, anywhere, has either got a red or a burnt red new growth, or as they age they often become reddish, or they go brown, which is again still into something in like I call this a reddish earth colour. And I just find that gives it a more natural look than if I was to try and do it with just a without that red look to it. And again, I think I might just go a little bit higher here. I want this to be, but I'm going to start going a little bit more feathered. The other thing to remember is when we're going around something, where that went over the branch that I've drawn, that's a bit of foliage over the branch. I'll deal with that later, which of course it often does anyway, so that part's fine. A little bit of feathering there, and I'm just going to go back up here a bit higher. Always thinking about composition, but at the same time, so whatever's happening on one side of a branch or a tree trunk in particular, just bring a little bit of it over to the other side so that it's there's a continuity, because what we're painting is background, it's actually back behind, and so you're not going to get one thing on one side of it and a different thing on the other. So always just be aware of that as well. And just a little bit of feathering just up in here, and then I'm going to call it quits so that you can all let go. If you've got a clean palette,
If you have a what?
a clean palette, it hasn't got all these lovely
No.
colours sitting on it, it's a case of having to put colours on there, you know, whatever, some sap green, but then go in with the other I'm going to make that a little bit greyer up here. A bit different. And if I do end up half finishing a sentence, by all means remember to finish it for me. I'm okay with that. And I think I'm pretty much done. If I've lost some of these branches that I've drawn in up the top here, I'm not going to be too concerned. I'll probably just put little bits of dark in there without going too heavy as well. I will probably play with this area a bit more later on. But I just want a little bit of feathering in there. And the last thing I need is just again a bit of burnt sienna up in here. Now if you wanted to add a bit of highlight, like I did that green, the lighter green, it's the same process. You can add a little bit of that, probably while it's still moist, because that's not quite as, but even now,
Add a bit of what, sorry?
a lighter green.
Lighter green.
Yeah, a little bit of a highlight colour. And so that just adds a little bit of interest in there as well. I think I'm going to leave it there. So the things to remember, mixing your greens and mixing your colours before you start, mixing 2 or 3 different colours, having your burnt sienna ready to go so that you can come straight back in with that, and a little bit of that lemon green if you want to, and pretty much that's it. Okay, all good. Alright, so we're going to get started again, and I've actually started two while we're at it, because they're slightly different references, and since I apparently sent you the one I didn't start on, I thought if I do both of them we can work that way. I could have sworn I'd sent you that one, but you get that. Okay, so who's doing this one? Just so that I know. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2 are doing this one. Okay, that's fine, because a lot of it works the same anyway. There's not that much difference between one and the other. So I'll just continue. I might just do a little bit more on this one, and all this needs is a bit of foreground now, so that's the next little bit. We don't need to make the foreground be anything too startling, okay? So even here you can add just a little bit of water. I'll do this one and then I'll do the other one. Now the reason for that is to just to give it a bit of flow, so that you're not working just on it just comes together a bit better. Okay, so I'm just going to use a couple of colours. That was raw umber, which is again one of my the earth colours that I like, and a bit of burnt sienna. Now I'm still going to add a little bit of my grey into that, my grey green. Probably mostly the dark one at this stage. And again, so up here you need a bit of connection, so that we don't have just a total change of scenery. It's all part of the same scene. And over here as well. The foregrounds are great because you can just put some paint in. It doesn't have to be perfect. There's no such thing as perfection in painting. I don't. Probably much better if we don't, because it's much more useful. And a little bit of the other green as well.
Dark green.
That was a dark green. Now just a hint of this to go through as well. And so you notice that I haven't done a straight line across the bottom of the trees. Be really, really wary of that, because again, they just won't read as well as if you muck that up. That's it on that one. And a similar thing on this one. What did I do here? Yep, just a little bit of all of those colours. As I paint, I do actually use my masking tape as part of the painting. The reason for that is that I don't end up with huge amounts of these tiny little white marks in places where I don't want them. If you're actually working on the edges and working it all the way through, it does make a difference. And it seems to be a bit of... Now on that one, I didn't, I think put a little bit of, didn't do a whole bunch of difference. This one I think is a little bit more variation between those two. And the other thing will be that there's some difference in tone. I tend to be quite rough when I'm doing foregrounds, especially for the foregrounds for the bush, because they really are just a bit of everything. And Lastly, the other bit I like to put in them even now is, I'm going to get some burnt umber. I'm just going to put some dark marks in there. It might be just a little bit of tree branches, bits of dirt, bits of other stuff. So again, don't go overboard about it, and you can really think about it and even compose those bits if you want to. It's just to put some stuff down at the moment. Later on we can play with that a bit more once you've stood back from your painting, which makes a huge difference, by the way. If you're unsure about what you're doing, put your painting up on an easel or a table or something like that and stand back. It's really important to do so. I usually wait until I've got everything, all parts of my painting finished before I actually do that, but you can do it any time. Now look how much more interesting that immediately became because I did that extra little bit of dark in there. And just making sure that that's light enough that I can do a bit of stuff there. That's it. That's a foreground. Okay. Right. The one thing about that I always forget to mention something. When you're doing foregrounds, I don't have a lot of foreground here. A little bit more in this one. But one of the things about a foreground, in particular where it's bush and everything like that, the rougher you can do the brush work, the rougher you can do your brush work, the better it becomes. You've got more to work with when you come back in to fine tune it, if you want to put it that way. So, and the other thing is more contrast. Don't have it all the same tone if you can avoid it. If you have some lights and darks, even in this early stage, the first bit, it does make a difference. But of course we will be working on these again, so that part is fine. Next is, now we're into the tree trunks. With this one, we have mostly your standard grey Australian bush gum trees. There's a little bit of dark stuff there, and there's not much else. So that means we need to play with greys again. So we don't want the green greys at the moment. So working in a different part of my palette. At the moment my greyish palette green grey looks like that. It's a little bit, it's almost right, but it could afford to be a little bit more not quite so purple, I suppose. Yeah. But even though that's in the scheme of things, it would be okay. So I'm just going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to that, and all of a sudden it just now becomes just that little bit lighter. And the other thing is I prefer not to mix them too much. And the other colour I would perhaps put into that is a little bit of cerulean, just to cool that down in places. So with the burnt sienna warms it, but the cerulean can actually cool it down and make it more of a blue-grey. So I love having variety with what I do, and so that's where I'm going to start. I'll just do this one on the side. There's a little bit of extra stuff there. Do I want that? I don't think it matters that much. If I decided I didn't want it, I can soften that back. Don't need to change it entirely, but if I needed to soften that. So I'm just going to use that. Now, because if I was to work standard without being upside down, I probably would go downwards, but no, actually I probably wouldn't. This is actually working quite nicely. See how I'm just dragging my brush up, and see how it's leaving some whites. If I didn't want them, I can colour them in. If I want the top section to be a little bit cooler, and I've just added some cerulean to that, bringing a bit of it into here. I think I'm going to disappear most of those whites that I've just left there. And I'm going to, that's a little bit too blue, but just coming back in. And there is another branch back here somewhere. Before I go any further on that, I'm going to get some dark. With that, I'm going to add my burnt umber to ultramarine so that I get that. Okay, effectively it's black, okay, but when we put it here, it gives me a lovely deep dark, and maybe not quite so dark up here, but coming in. Now this is still wet. It works much better if you can do this while it's still wet, because it bleeds across and it becomes an area rather than I'm just going to put a little bit of variation into some of these. I'm going to make this one darker, just there, but just little bits of that, and that just makes it more what our trees look like. Don't outline. Please, please, please don't come along and end up with a tree that looks like this. Do it differently. So that we end up with a straight line on this side. Paint's not working.
You can't do it wrong.
I know. It's true. I really struggle to do it wrong. I do. But we're sort of not looking for that type of mark. Okay. At the most, if you wet that up, at least, and muck it up, anything that's really natural and everything, it just requires a bit of mucking up every so often. But that being so much more natural than just having a line on either side. There are very, very few lines in nature, so always be aware of that. This one back here is much darker, and so I'm going to use burnt umber and ultramarine without mixing them totally. Can you see how that's, and I can even go a little bit more into the brown. So you've got a variation of colour there. If you don't mix it as much, it becomes a much nicer, more natural sort of progression of things happening. Getting to the point where I'm using my brush with the point now, and this is one of the reasons you actually do use have brushes that have good points, because then you can use them both on the flat and also on the point. Just doing a little bit of extra detail here with some of the finer branches. Don't necessarily need to do, and just a little bit up there as well. This one's a bit weird, so we'll just do that one in. And again, just watching some of the lines, making sure that they all make sense, read right, is another thing. So that's given me some, Again, not wanting to, even that one, don't like what happened there. I've ended up with some weird marks on the bottom. I'm just going to come back in and just give it a bit more of a foreground, grounding it so that it becomes part of the landscape. You can't have a tree that's jumping. It's just not possible. So, okay. Now the last one is quite light in comparison. The thing is, it's much lighter here where it's darker around it. It's going to be a little bit darker here because you can see it better. Okay, I'll just use what I've got on my brush. That'll be fine, but I've just dipped it into water. That's quite blue. Might just bring in some of that and change up the colour a little bit. Okay, a bit too blue. So remember, don't have this as a straight line at the bottom. That just won't read, won't be a tree thing. Now, so much for having that light. Totally forgot. I'm going to just take some of that back. That's better. If it had any sense, I would have just softened my brush off a bit. The other way to do that would be to actually put water into that area. And either way is fine. Can't remember where the branches is. I've lost my sketch. So that's ended up a little bit darker there than I anticipated, but it'll still work. It'll still work okay. I'm going to put just a little bit of warmth into that. See what happened here where I put the brush, where I put that extra water in? It's pushed the paint to the side, and which has given it that nice darkness on that side. While I'm at it, I might as well just continue that by putting a little bit of extra water there and taking advantage of that part of things happening. I love working with the paint. The paint is so responsive, and if you work with it as opposed to trying to make it do everything that you want it to do, it becomes far more enjoyable for starters. I like, again, changing up the colours just a little bit, and I think this one down here is just a little bit darker, so I'm just going to do that as well. Play with this a little bit, and that's pretty much it for that one. We could go darker on the bottom because there is actually some black stuff happening there, and that just means that I've put in some nice deep darks. Let's play with it, have it do something really nice. I'll decide later on whether I want to change that up there as well, if I need to close in some of those lights that I've just made. But yeah, I think that's good enough for the moment on that one. And quickly, I'll just do this one so that you see how it. This one's a bit warmer. It's actually got quite a bit of warmth in this one, and that just means that the colour changes that little bit more. I'm going to put a bit more burnt sienna in this one. But effectively, it is a similar colour. No, I'm going to.
Forget about the cerulean in this.
Did I forget about the cerulean? Yeah, of course I did.
You,
Sorry.
this one, we won't put this cerulean.
It's a little bit different. Good. Some of that might work all right up here. close that in, I think. And we're looking at some darker. I've just put burnt sienna and burnt umber or something similar on my brush at the same time, and that will give me nice and strong. If you're wanting something really strong, it works much better. And I'm not against putting a little bit of blue into that area as well. So,
What's that brush you use? When,
it's a sable,
no, the one here. What do you call that?
this one. Sorry.
No, you use your fingers.
Oh, this brush. This is
Yeah,
this is a great brush. It's always with me. I know exactly where it is every time. It works a treat. It's true. I do actually, surprisingly, not unsurprisingly, perhaps use it a lot, because if I've got a bit of a mark there that I don't particularly like, and I just change it. So it works really well. So it's quite cool at the top here, and I've just come in straight up with some cerulean just in that area. Now you notice that it's quite light though, it's not a dark colour, and when I come back in with what I've also got on my brush, which is the same colour as this, it just adds that extra layer of variation to this. And I think, oh, I wish I'd taken that back, but we'll work with that a bit later on. And I forgot to do this one, which is actually a brownish one. No, I'll keep working on this one first. And I'm going to put some dark colour in there, a bit of burnt sienna. Let's go over top of that because I don't like that mark. And a bit up here. So again, we have a, what do I say? It's a very much a organic shape. It's an organic thing. So you can be quite rough with these things if you don't try to make them do exactly what you want. See how I'm got a fair bit of paint on my brush and I'm just dragging it. But I'm not trying to make it look all filled in. I'm only just doing one part of it and allowing it to be that. And I've just add a hint of ultramarine on my brush that time too. So little bits of extra marks even as it's still drying. Makes that look, don't like that. That's better. Yep. I do use that brush a fair bit. And look, we can still play with this a bit later on. At the moment I just want to put in some rougher marks because we can play with that a bit more. One more, just this quick one down the back here, which is either a branch at the back or it's another tree. I can't remember, I don't quite know which. And a little bit, I'm going to put a bit of blue on that. Again, the reason is I think it's actually a branch. What do you reckon?
Yeah.
I think so. And again, just mucking it up a bit. Mostly about getting your trees coloured with some greys and a little bit of variation as well. Okay. So for the next thing that I do is actually stand back from my painting at this stage once I've covered pretty much the whole lot. So I stand back and I say, well, okay, what's working? where do I need to change something up, and how do I work with this now. Most of the time it's a tonal thing that is the problem now. So for instance, the tones here in this background area are quite nice, whereas here it's a little bit wishy-washy. So I might just up the ante to make that, push that back a little bit further, to make that contrast between where the background is and the foreground. Okay, just a little bit of change, it won't take a lot. The foreground then is, of course, just needs some interest. They're all just a little bit bland at the moment. And of course we need things that look like branches and rocks and grass and all that sort of thing there as well. As far as the trees go, what I find interesting about the two paintings is that one is very cool with their tree trunks and the other one's really quite warm. And both of them are valid because that's what we have, all sorts of things happening. Then there's just a bit of texture, a little bit more. We've done the basics, it's all there, and I just need to make them a little bit rougher because, and just to make sure that that they both become interesting. If I needed to, I could add a little bit more foliage towards the top as well, especially maybe just a few bits of dark coming across some of those branches. And just to, I've got a little bit of it happening here, and I'm not quite sure what's happening there, but it doesn't quite read right, but it's close. So I might just deal with a little bit of that area there. There's a very strange looking branch there. Sorry about that. So we might just fix that one up as well. Thank you.
Well, Brendan?
Yep.
Yeah, do you need any more foliage, particularly in this one here, because you know, you've got the base of the tree, and gum trees tend to have their foliage
Right up high.
there. Okay,
Yeah,
and rarely
that is
much
true.
down below.
But at the same time, I think I'm going to add an extra little tree here. I've actually allowed it, I just forgot about it. So I'll put that tree in, and that will have foliage in that area, and that's what that'll do. So I'll play with those a little bit. I'll start on that one again. Okay, so my background foliage just needs a little bit of extra interest, and by that I mean perhaps a little bit of an occasional darker tree trunk. I didn't even mention that before, and just something in the background that just without being too specific. I just want to have some suggestions of something else. I don't even really want to make them too. The hardest part about doing this sort of thing is not having them all so spelt out and actually end up with a whole little row of exactly the same type of trees. So you do need to bring your brain into action. Painting is very much a mental activity. It's not just about putting brush to paper. You often have to really think about what you're doing. And perhaps just a little twig there or something or other. Okay, foreground. Often it's about, I don't like the whites in there, so what I'm going to do right now is actually just soften those back. Not with that brush, obviously. Where's that one? That one. I'm just going to soften all that in, because I don't like those whites. A little bit, sometimes they work, but in this case it's sort of very, it's a muted sort of scene because there's not much light there. Now that I've done that, I'm going to come back in with some very deep darks here and there. And the reason I'm just doing some more random sort of things is that it will give me some variety in there. If you've got a specific mark on this side of that tree trunk, make sure you've got a hint of it on the other side as well. And I'm going to come back in with a bit of burnt sienna. Again, as much as anything, stronger colour, much as anything, just to add interest. And if we really want to, we can get some greens into there as a little bit. Foregrounds, backgrounds are often harder than doing the main subject, because there's so much variation. You have to work with them being just interesting, but not actually to overtaking the focal point. I'm actually going to bring a little bit of sienna into this one, because I find that's almost a little bit too blue. So if I just straight over top and warm some of that up.
What are you going over the top with?
Bit of burnt sienna. And again, it's more so that it just is not quite so blue. I just find it was a little bit too blue. And that'll actually just give it that. Now, I feel like I've got a branch here and one going back behind. And just to make that happen a little bit better, I'm just going to work with that. And that basically just to bring that one, or put on my water point, put that one at the back. Okay, a little bit of texture by running my brush gently over the colour with just a bit of, over the tree trunk even. Like I said, it's mostly about light and shade at this stage. Fixing a few things up. I don't need those dark light spots on this one. So again, not changing anything, except that I'm just wetting that area in so that they're not still white. To make a bit of texture on this one, fairly dry brush. It's not, I haven't got lots of paint on there, and I'm just going to run my brush over here as much as anything, just to give it that bit of extra texture. And I don't think I'm going to do too much to this one. Was there anything else that was specifically working there? Did say something about foliage, so I'm just going to not use that brush, use a smaller one. Just put a little bit of foliage just here, just darken that up. I don't like those marks, so if I have some darker foliage around it, they will blend in a bit more. So, and I don't like that mark either, so I'm just a little bit of that blue green that we had earlier. This is also one of the reasons we like to keep that airiness, so that shows you that it's in the background. It gives you an opportunity, if you don't do everything all at once, it gives you an opportunity to come back a bit later on and play with some of these things. And I think if I play with that probably any more, I'll regret it. And I might just put a little bit of extra texture in there. Same colour. Find that just a little bit too flat just there, so again. And I think that's about it. Anything else that I need? Anybody?
That looks pretty good. Koala maybe?
Koala? Okay. Yeah. I think I'll leave that one the way it is. We'll, there's more I could do to it, but at the same time it's an exercise effectively, and so I'll leave it there, and I'll just finish this one off as well. What this one in particular needs, the trees in particular need some texture, but I do need some just variety here. I want to make those ones there look a little bit more like that's the bottom of the trees here, and at the moment it's just not quite happening. Won't take a lot of work to do so. Just needs to say, well, this is where there's some foliage. Now, I did actually forget this other little tree over here. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ignore you. We'll fix that up now. And I think I'm okay with that. So some of these edges, I don't mind some of them, but at the same time I've got to be careful not to have, otherwise you have to put the matting over top of what you're painting, which is why I like painting on the masking tape, because that becomes part of my painting. And I think that part of things is fine. A little bit of greyish something or other there. Maybe keep a cool one. Let's keep this guy fairly light, maybe. Just a straight one. I don't really want that one to be too spelt out. I just want it to be in the background, but at the same time I think I still need just a little bit of dark along one side. Okay. I'm quite happy for that one to get a little bit lost in amongst all that bush. Foreground. Now this one I really want to muck up. I want to, and I've been known to grab some paint and just go like that, which I won't do tonight. The main way to muck things up is literally to grab some strong paint. Don't be half-hearted about it. Because with it being, and then come back in with a bit of dark underneath that, and all of a sudden you've got rocks. You might have a log, and it can be something. Maybe there's that suggestion of another tree there somewhere, perhaps on this side as well. So I'm just using that, and where these tree trunks come to the ground, there's often some really rugged marks happening, and they need to, oops, that was probably a little bit too much. If you've got fingernails, you can actually make marks in that as well, though I don't like that much. So I'll just muck that up again. I liked it better before. Not that one. And I actually wanted a little bit of coolness down that bottom corner. Just going to wash that in a bit. Again, I just feel like I need to watch how many whites I've got on the foreground here. And it's very easy just to soften those off, because then they just work quite nicely as lights instead of whites. And yeah, so yeah, and of course you could actually do a little bit of grass if you wanted to, even just do little bits of it, but we'll probably get to some of that later on.
There's a fern.
There's a fern,
That's a fern.
you see?
It's got a fern. It's got a little fern.
Of course. Okay, so the last thing is the tree trunks, and really all I'm looking for that is that extra bit of texture. And I'm just going to run my brush. It's a little bit about this is why I like dry brush. This is why I like the rough paper, is because it gives me this texture just by very, very lightly running my brush over the paper. And all of a sudden we have those tree trunks that have that bark that might be coming off. Or I kind of like this little bit of white that I've left there, so I'm going to keep that there. Just darken that a little bit, and ultimately that one's probably fairly right, except that it needs some more branches. As soon as I look to do little branches and stuff like that, I will bring my brush at the end. And I could use a rigger for this as well, which is not a bad idea, because that way you get some finer marks entirely. Funnily enough, they don't all have to meet up either. You can actually just work that way as well. Same thing here, I'm just going to put a bit of texture on here, some darker marks, so that often if I've got darker marks to put on there, I do them over top where there's already a suggestion of dark, and that way you're not losing all the lights as well. And I think I don't want to take up too much of your painting time, but otherwise it's called homework. We always have homework. A little bit of extra warmth up in there, and I could call that quits, I think. I would have another look at it and see whether there's anything else that I need to do, but at the moment I think that might do. Perhaps just a hint of darker green again at the top, and oops, I lost that a bit. and just to give it some extra depth even up here. You might have a little bit coming over top of that branch, that part of the tree as well. And brush is not working that well tonight. Don't be afraid to come across some of the branches that you've already made, because that again just allows it to be part of the scene instead of having them separate. Alright, that's enough. I need you to do what's... no, I do need just a little bit more. I know, I'm sorry. Just again, it's about texture, which I was planning on doing a little bit more about the texture tonight, but that's okay. We've got at least some here tonight, so. Okay, have some fun with that.
In this lesson, we went back to one of the first exercises when we painted around the tree trunks negatively, except that we used a palette of grey-greens to do so. The foreground was where we were to let go and not be too careful, so that we had something messy to play with after we painted our grey trees. Each section was painted in 2 layers, a base of random but somewhat considered colour, and then after reviewing our painting from a distance, we were able to judge what was needed in the second layer. This was a big departure from previous lessons. It's all starting to get serious now. So let's move on to something similar but with more texture and colour.